During the height of urban renewal and redevelopment, the same ideals were followed across the country. The main goal was to clear cities of blight. These acts of bulldozing and slum clearance disproportionately affected minorities, kicking families from their homes, making them relocate, often with nowhere to go, and forcing them to live in poverty for the sake of the middle-class white Americans' gaze and personal use. With this came something that most wouldn't realize: zoo renewal. The drive for more ethical animal keeping, as well as the demand for conservation of certain species, led keepers and zoo management to redesign and reimagine the conditions in which animals were kept and displayed for white middle-class visitors. The first zoo opened in 1874, and zoos have been entertaining and teaching guests ever since. With the primary intentions of increasing animal enjoyment and health came with it motives for guest enjoyment. This meant new, immersive naturalistic enclosures to get rid of guests' feelings of sadness over the prison-like conditions of the animals' exhibits prior. This feeling of sadness is the same sort of pity that came with blighted areas in the inner city. To show the comparison between white pity and flight in urban zoos and the city surrounding them, let's focus on the Bronx Zoo while touching on other national examples. Before discussing the case of the Bronx Zoo in particular, it's important to note examples of how a highly racialized America was portrayed in parallels in zoos around the country during this time. For example, the Antelope House at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., kept animals in small, concrete-floored enclosures with prison bars for a barrier. The wood slats for walls mimicked those used in the living accommodations for the poor in the inner city, and this picture of the animal conditions nearly perfectly replicates post-war pictures of a street of condemned minority housing. The small enclosures within the Antelope House were torn down due to them being a fire hazard, and many animals in these conditions died of disease. As tuberculosis swept New York City housing due to a lack of sunlight and proper ventilation within low-income homes, zoo animals fell victim to the same fate. Another example, the Zoological Society of San Francisco unveiled their exhibit, Keeping Up with Our Gorillas, during this time. In the same suburban family style of the saying, Keeping Up with the Joneses. The gorillas were kept in a habitat eerily similar to a public park in the surrounding neighborhood, which was considered to be blighted. The exhibit was decorated with native rocks and trees, and they were provided with human-used enrichment items. Gorillas playing in their park-esque enclosure and minorities doing the same in their community park painted a subconscious picture in guests' minds. The water moat that separated the gorillas from the guests further pushed the narrative of gentrification and segregation of worlds. Perhaps the most prominent example of a history of racism in zoos is when the Bronx Zoo, the focus of my case study, brought a man from what is present-day Democratic Republic of Congo. His name was Otabenga, and he was displayed in the monkey house. The zoo, in this case, had no intentions on educating guests or caring for the welfare of Otabenga, but instead used him for entertainment, their actions rooted in white supremacy. The effects of these months kept in captivity, this abuse, led Otabenga to take his own life. The New York Zoological Society, now known as the Bronx Zoo, opened on Wednesday, November 8, 1899. The flyer featured the American bison, a symbol of America at the time. Bison populations were at an all-time low following presidential orders to kill off the species to get rid of the Indian problem, as titled by Ulysses S. Grant. The Bronx Zoo, after New York City donated 250 acres of land to the society, planned their first map along Pelham Parkway. The Bronx Zoo was the start of many firsts when it came to zoological parks, and the layout of the zoo has changed drastically with time. Zoos are constantly using ideas from each other to help ensure the best possible environment for guests and animals to further the success of animal species conservation in the wild. The Bronx Zoo initially hosted about 842 species and now hosts over 10,000, so major adjustments have had to be made to accommodate every species on just over 255 acres of land. An important aspect in the design of the zoo was to maintain as much of the natural environment as possible. While improvements to animal enclosures and care had hidden agendas in some cases, this isn't to say that the Bronx Zoo didn't make massive strides in conservation. Besides the great success that their American bison breeding program had in repopulating the species in the wild, the Bronx Zoo also raised groundbreaking buildings with the species in mind, setting an example for zoos around the world. In 1969, the Bronx Zoo had their first. World of Darkness with cutting-edge technology opened to house many species of nocturnal animals. This exhibit, designed by Morris Ketchum, was crafted with lighting in mind. Through scientific research, it was found that reversing the nocturnal cycle of animals didn't harm them. So by keeping animals in the dark during the day, guests could view species at their most active. Similarly, a $4 million project was opened in 1972, hosting over 200 bird species. The massive building, called World of Birds, was multi-leveled, mimicking the treetops and the varying levels of a rainforest where birds dwell. The guest view of these species was completely unobscured, and for the first time, there was no screen, glass, or cage separating the animals from the people. This period of zoo reform came during the height of urban renewal. Coincidence? Maybe not. The idea of keeping exotic animals in captivity is a heated debate now, but back then, the jail cell-like enclosures in poor conditions were thought of as simply unsightly, similar to the blighted areas surrounding the zoo itself. The Bronx Zoo wasn't the only zoo who went through this reform for the same reasons. In fact, this was a national initiative. The San Diego Zoo and the Washington Zoo are two more in the long list of zoos following this initiative to get rid of cages, both urban locations with several blighted areas. This begs the question, was the renewal for the animals at all? Or was it because the white middle-class guests of the attraction couldn't stand the animal form of blight? While the areas surrounding these urban zoos had mass demolition and families kicked out from their homes in order to better the image of the city, animals got enclosures with a more aesthetic appeal. White and albino forms of regular animals were bred, and while the white coat was typically a genetic mutation and caused lots of problems for the animal, such as for the Siberian tiger, the animal needs weren't put before the profit and more desirable white gene. With the same timeline as urban renewal, zoo renewal seemed to further push ideas of segregation, gentrification, white flight, and slum clearance.